Okay, we'll go ahead and get started now. Welcome everybody to my second talk, RESTful API Evolution with Spring. Hopefully, I see a number of faces in here that I recognize from my last talk, RESTful API Design with Spring. So if you take a look at the two different talks, basically in my last one, whether or not you were there, I told you how to build a REST API using Spring. And this one, I'm going to tell you how to change it, because change is inevitable, especially in something as loosely defined as REST. You know, it's easy to get wrong the first time, and you can see ways to improve it, and we need to figure out how to manage that stuff, and that's what this talk is all about. And in truth, every time I've ever done the RESTful API design talk, afterwards, invariably, most of the discussions end up turning to, okay, so I've got this REST API, but I need to change it. How do I do that? And so that's why this talk even exists. But before I start, I'm gonna let you guys in on a little secret. Last night, I had a couple of drinks at the party, went back to my room at a reasonable hour, and proceeded to stay up all night. I am deathly terrified of this particular presentation. First, because it's the first time I've ever given it, but also because if you think REST is ill-defined, and there is no right in REST, this is really ill-defined. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about some of the stuff I've done to migrate REST APIs, to change them. It's not to say that it's right. It's not to say that it's wrong. It's not to say it's going to work for you. It's not going to say that it's going to work for the guy next to you, right? But what I do actually want to do with this talk, since so much of sort of my between session talk is about evolving APIs, is I want to turn this into a bit of a birds of a feather session, right? Everybody's here because they've had to change an API, or they're looking to change an API. And so the talk is, I don't know, 15, 20 slides. It goes into, we'll do some coding on, you know, how I've done the things I've done with Spring. But I want to talk to you guys. I want you guys to hear each other and how exactly, you know, what kind of things you've run into. Why certain strategies you tried didn't work. Why certain strategies you tried did work. So anybody who's ever been to a talk of mine, man, I love discussion. And this one, I want even more discussion than that, okay? For anybody who wasn't in my first one, I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Ben Hale. I am a software engineer at Pivotal. These days, I'm actually a Ruby developer. But that being said, I hope you don't hold that against me. I have been with the Spring project since, not its inception, but certainly since we became a company way back in 2006. I've worked on everything from core Spring, the Spring Webflow products, Spring MVC stuff, all the way through doing some OSGI work when we had an ill-fated OSGI-based application server. But most pertinent to this talk is that for quite a number of years, I worked on a product that was nothing but a giant REST API. It was like 400, 500 endpoints on it, and it was all about managing middleware, because I started my career doing network monitoring and management, and I am doomed to continue doing that until my dying days, I am convinced at this point. So I have some experience here, and I think that really, I think that's why I am so drawn to doing this talk, is all the things that I talk about are huge pain points to me, right? And so we'll start by saying, your RESTful API, version 2, right? Everybody who walked out of my first session, you've got a RESTful API now, right? You've got everything you need. You got, you know, exactly what the verbs are. You know what URIs are supposed to identify. You know how to do those crazy business things, such as selecting and opening and closing and stuff like that, except only using the HTTP verbs, which don't have select, open, or close. But now you're going to have to change it, right? Nothing is ever static. So we need an API to accommodate these changes, but even more fundamentally to how exactly they're implemented. The question is, how do you manage this change? The reason we write RESTful APIs is so that we can get a huge breadth of customers, of clients that can use them. The reason we use strategies like HATOS or you know, very strong media typing and stuff like that, and content negotiation, is so that we don't have to know who's on the other end. We might, you know, certainly in an ideal situation inside an enterprise, you might have a very good idea who all of your clients are, and you might actually have some control over them even. Although in an enterprise, that seems unlikely now, doesn't it? But you gotta ask yourself, can you even in the case where you did control all of the clients to your REST API, can you force all of your clients to upgrade simultaneously? nobody at SpringSource listens to me ever, you know? I mean, I couldn't possibly try and do this, much less any of our paying customers. How do you maintain backwards compatibility in the time frame that you can't force everyone to upgrade? And so that's what we're going to discuss here. And so, a little pun to start the morning, to the REST queue, right? REST is limited, right? No one's going to argue that. Entities are URIs, and you got 4 plus a couple verbs that you get to play with. The bad is there isn't a huge amount of stuff you can do to manage this change, right? But on the good side, you don't have to worry about all that much, right? It's a very clear set of things that you have to worry about when change has to be managed. So REST gives us all of the building blocks we need to make systems that evolve over time. It was one of the fundamental principles that Fielding was aiming for there, was this idea that given the fact that anyone can connect to your service, how do you evolve that service? How do you make it flexible enough? How do you make these two systems decoupled enough such that they can evolve independently of one another? And so when I say that REST and HTTP in particular give us all the tools we need, we go back to a couple of slides you guys have seen from the last one. Uniform interface, identification of resources using URIs, manipulation of resources, self-descriptive messages, hypermedia as the engine of application state. As a quick refresher, in HTTP's parlance for its uniform interface, URIs identify resources. URIs identify nouns, right? If you've got a verb in your URI, you've done something wrong. HTTP verbs describe a limited set of operations that can be used. We've got the big 4, get, delete, put, and post. There are some others. I only sort of recognize head and options, but WebDAV has added some other extensions as well that a lot of people use. But I don't think you need them, really. Given post, you can do anything you want, right? You can do a get with a post if you want to. And then we use headers to describe the messages. So this is where we start launching into code. So how many people here have had to evolve an API? Yeah. So a fair number of you guys. So talk to me about sort of the kinds of things with regards specifically to schema changes, or sorry, to URL schema changes. What kind of things have you run into that were problems for you? And what strategies did you actually use to do those migrations? Versioning, yeah. How do you version an API, right? Given that it's a bunch of URI endpoints that return a bunch of payloads, how do you make sure that a customer that wants to go to version 2 of your API can hit that at the same time that someone who's on version 1 of your API can hit it, right? What was your solution for that? Added V2, right? Yep, in the URL. It's totally common to do something like that, right? And I refer to that as a naive URL scheme change, right? So let's see if I can actually do that. Let us start. OK, so in this guy, we have a different model this time. In this model, we have, let's see, naive. Here we go. We've got an owner. You want to talk simple. All of the implementations you're going to see today, I put a special mark on naive, right? I mean, like, I'm hard coding IDs and values inside of them. I knew them up all over the place. So don't get wrapped around the axle about what exactly this application is using. Just sort of focus on this idea that we have an owner. That owner is me. And I have a cat. And his name is Loki, the god of mischief. Great for demos, obviously. So what we want to do is take this idea of I have a way to talk about owners, and I have a way to talk about cats. But I need to change it, right? And the way I need to change it, for everybody who's familiar with this, with Spring's MVC stuff, is I say here I've got a request mapping. If I want an owner, I need to go to /naive/v1/owners/owner-id, and I can find out about that particular owner. If I want to find out about cats, I get to go to naive v1 cats and put in an ID, and we'll find out about a cat. Let's see what happens when I do that. Still not great. I need to find a way to change the font size on this thing, that's for sure. So let's say naive owners 0. Not found. Of course it's not found. V1, thank you. I'm glad somebody knows this. No sleep is really, really. Did I spell that wrong? I'm sure it's probably just not even running the right application at this point. Probably should have tested this before I stood up here. Oh, hold on. I'll bet you it's the exact same mistake I made earlier. Yep. Oh, no. That's right. This is really going to go badly then. Right. Okay. 404 not found. Slash owner ID, I would have expected that to work.
You got one of the other headers selected in the list?
I might, yes. Well, it wouldn't give me a 404, I wouldn't think, but no.
Just a guess.
Yeah, thank you.
404 is a routing issue.
Yep, absolutely. 404 is a routing issue. Well, yeah. No, so that's really going badly. Okay, let's take a step back and say, what can we do without this actual demo? So we have a request mapping that looks like this, right? But we know that the change that we actually want to make is right now cats aren't owned by owners, sort of. They're not encapsulated by owners, let's say. And while Loki certainly feels that way about me, I think I could leave and he would not even notice. I don't think that's a great idea. I think cats should actually be encapsulated by owners. So I need to make a change so that I end up with a v2 API that instead of saying naive/v1/cats, instead says naive/v1/owners/owner ID/cats instead, right? So how do we do this, right? One of the big problems that we see when we want to version an API using this naive strategy, right? Basically slap a v2 in front of it, is there's a huge duplication of code, right? Because fundamentally, all of these version changes, they're minor. Compared to the number of endpoints you've got, the amount of business logic that's in it, you're just replicating absolutely everything. So maybe in the best case scenario, you could reuse a lot of the code that you've got. And it turns out Spring is quite good about this, although it appears you'll have to trust me. This actually works. You can say, in addition to servicing that particular URI, I can say naive v2 owners owner ID cats, right? It's good for cats, obviously. You need to come back to naive owner controller back here as well. Make sure that he knows what's going on at the same time. Right, so this is great because we get to reuse all the same code. We've just changed a URI structure. And so you see sort of a very, very happy scenario. But you could see, you know, there are a lot of possibilities for where you're going to end up with, you know, slight differences that involve huge abstract base class hierarchies and things like that, just so that you don't have to write a whole lot of code, right? So what kind of things, for people who've actually had to do this, other than the duplication of code, what other kinds of problems have you seen with just slapping a v2 on the front of this? Anything? Has that worked primarily for people who've done that? No? It's going to go really quick, guys. Especially if I can't get my demos to run. So it seems like a good idea. Additional mapping, additional entries to request mapping. You get to reuse a lot of code where it works, right? But it breaks down pretty quickly, right? It's very unlikely that your entire change is encapsulated in the idea that I need to make cats owned by owners, right? What happens if the cat's payload is a little bit different? What happens if some operation like creating a cat is slightly different between the two of them? It needs some other additional information. How do you communicate the API changes to the consumers, right? You've got a consumer that's hitting V1. If he wants to go to V2, if he wants this sort of new cat owned by owner kind of relationship in the way he's consuming your service. How do they know this stuff, right? And the answer is this particular strategy, not great, right? Not great at all. So we have Hatos, right? How many people in here are already using Hatos in any form, right? Links, media types, anybody? Wow. I would have hoped it would have been a lot more of you. Hatos is really the way that all change management to a RESTful API is managed, right? The client doesn't have a built-in knowledge of how to navigate and manipulate the model. Instead, the server provides us that information dynamically, and we do this by using link relations and media types. So link relations, for those who aren't familiar with them, basically say that a client can't be expected to know what a resource is related to and where those relations are located. The server describes them to the user using well-known names, and then the user basically takes the URL there as an opaque thing, right? And it just navigates to it. Has no idea the structure of the API, right? And this is great, because it means I can change the API as much as I want, right? Doesn't affect anybody. As long as everybody is following those links rather than hard-coding URLs, it's great. So let me ask you now, for all of you guys who aren't using Hatos, how many people are documenting multiple URLs, multiple public endpoints that people can hit? Yeah. So I assume you've got a big problem, right? You want to change one of those endpoints, everybody's got to know about it, right? You want to change where it is, what it's nested underneath, how it's related to something else. It's real problematic, right? So having link relations in Hatos really helps us out there. Yeah, please. Help me stall. Yeah. Sure. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Hatos is sort of restfulness is a continuum, right? And there are a couple of big sort of steps inside that continuum. And the first one is just getting back to nouns as URIs and using the HTTP verbs. The next step up there is HOS. It isn't as well known, obviously. In this room is a perfect example of that. And yeah, probably I should point it out more because it's great, right? It's difficult to implement, but yeah, sure, yeah. Yeah. How do you version errors? So give me an example of what you're looking for. Mm-hmm.
So in my second version of the API, I want the third errors to be added there. So how will client know that there is an added version of the errors present? So 500 might not be valid in the third version. So how do you take out errors and exception out of the API?
Yeah. So the question is around if you all of a sudden are going to generate a new error in the API and you're trying to maintain backwards compatibility, how do you deal with that? The answer is, unfortunately, REST breaks down a bit there. It is possible now that if you hit something, you may potentially get an error that you had not expected. It's not documented as part of the API. In general, in Spring, I would probably tackle this by only throwing a certain set of errors based on, and we'll get to it a little bit later, hopefully, based on what the media type that you were trying to get to. We're going to talk we're going to talk in great detail about media types and how they can be used to sort of select exactly which method runs inside of your application. Given that, selecting a V1 version of it that can only throw a certain set of exceptions versus selecting a V2 exception, right? If you say that I accept version 2 of a cat, right? That implies then that you also accept a certain set of exceptions that might occur, a certain set of errors that might occur when attempting to get V2 of the cat. So inside your implementation, you may handle all of those exceptions, but only certain methods should ever catch them. And it may be up to you. I mean, if you've sort of changed the deep plumbing of your service layer and it always throws this exception, it may literally be on you to maintain compatibility, capture that exception in version 1, and convert it to something else useful. Eat it, which you shouldn't do, or translate it into another exception that might be properly legal for version 1 of that particular API. Yeah, there's no direct linking between error failure modes and a particular URI, even with all of sort of the media types associated with it, but you can make that happen. You can sort of enforce that yourself, and I think that's probably the best way to go about it. Killing me. Yep. No, the thing that kills me is within the last 2 hours I've had this running. So clearly I have just totally screwed something up.
You know, only look at the path, because last time we changed the path from root to something else to root.
Yeah, which is exactly what I'm aiming for, yeah. So that should be what I'm seeing there, right? Yeah. Yep. Damn it. Okay. So we're going to continue on, and you'll get live code, but you're not going to get...
The producer's part of resolving
Yeah, it won't matter, I wouldn't think.
If you remove it from Tomcat and then right-click on your project, run on server, it'll tell you the right path to open up a browser with no clips.
Yeah, it's more that it's not mounting up inside of, yeah, I mean, it's not even catching it in the dispatcher servlet for whatever reason. Yeah. Yeah. So rather than sort of penalize you guys, we'll keep going. And you're going to see some code, and you're going to have to trust me on some of this stuff, unfortunately. OK, so what can we do differently then, right? If basically pointing everybody at a giant full stack of documentation with hundreds and hundreds of endpoints that are all concretely documented means that we can't change them. What can we do instead, right? And we say HateOS is a great way to do that. Okay, great. So we know how to implement HateOS. We know how to pass back location headers. We know how to pass back links inside of payloads and things like that. But how does that actually relate to an evolution of an application, right? How does it mean? What does using those actually give us other than links in the first place? And so if we take a look, so in this particular code, I hate you, go away. In this particular code, we've got a HateOS cat controller here. The HateOS cat controller, we don't have an actual implementation. We're going to use some of the HateOS software, right? We're going to use some of the bits and pieces of it. And specifically, we're going to use a resource assembler. And so the resource assembler is smart enough to then basically say, given a resource, I need to add a link. So I might say resource.add. For those of you guys who saw me a little bit earlier, you're going to get to see another very cool feature here. When I link to, in my previous talks, I've always linked to sort of the top level of the controller. So in this particular case, it might have gone to, the cat controller here. It would say cats. But to know, for example, that its ID is next, right, I'd have to put // and then that particular ID. Instead, one of the really cool things that you can do is you can say method on. So you can say on the HateOS cat controller. We need to fill in one of those a little bit later. We can say the read method, cat.getID. And this is a little bit weird, but let's take a look at what it actually says. It says, what I want you to do is be really sophisticated and execute on the HateOS cat controller, I want you to execute read, passing in this particular argument. And given that information, it can say, OK, here's the method I want to execute. Here's the argument that's actually going to pass in. So where Spring sort of has this one-way mapping from, if a URL comes in and it knows how to parse out cat ID, turn it into this integer that's passed into my method, HateOS can go the other direction on that exact same mapping. Given this ID, it knows how to put it here and then append that to the end of this guy right here. So now what I've said is I have no idea the structure of how the cat URL is implemented at all. I don't have like // or anything in there. So I can simply just create a new link. And I think I probably need to say with self-rel. I also probably want a link back to my owner. And we just want to say, so, oops, not on the cat controller because that's not where the URI for my particular owner is. It's actually on the owner controller. And we call read on him, giving an owner ID. Again, please forgive the incredibly naive implementation here where I'm newing up the owner. You'd obviously want a bit better data structures than that. And so in this case, I've added a rel that's called owner. And so one of the key things in HateOS, we talk about how we don't sort of standardize. We don't create a concrete API centered around URIs themselves. Instead, what we do is we create a concrete API around rels themselves, right? The way an owner gets to a cat, the way a cat gets to an owner is not because I know how to build this, 500 character long URI. Somebody asked me about using UUIDs as IDs inside of a URL. Sure, why not? As long as nobody sees it, who cares, right? But certainly you don't want people to have to go and extract what the UUID is and stuff like that. In fact, if this was rendering, you'd find out that I never actually pass out the ID of the cat. I suppress it, so you'd never really know it, much less how to assemble it into a URI. But this gives us the ability then to, if this whole thing started up, we could pull up an owner and it would have a link to the cats. Because it's built off of the particular URI inside of here. And then I could go from a cat back to an owner as well. And so to return that, you would simply say, wow, writing a bunch of code that you're never actually going to execute? Yeah. Not the best demos. I apologize, guys. I genuinely do. New cat. Yeah. So this guy, that resource assembler, knows how to create that cat and append all of those links to it. And so one of the really, really cool things I think about HateOS here, especially that stuff with the method on, right, where it knows how to reverse engineer this whole thing, right, based on mappings that you've already defined once, really, really super dry principle kind of stuff, is that now I could simply come in here and say, owners, owner ID, cats, right? I could even do this. Cats, right? Something like that. So I can actually listen in on both of those, right? So for people who are problematic and have hard-coded my URLs, I can still get to the cats thing, but I wouldn't expect most people to, right? Fundamentally, ignoring the sort of backwards compatibility because no one should have been using that URL question, this should have zero effect on a properly written client. I have the ability to make that change in any way I want, but as long as they're following links, and probably one of the key things here is because of the way we can reverse engineer those URLs, I've only made that change in one place. So it's guaranteed to ripple out through the entire application as we go along, right? Yeah, over there. What about bookmarks? Yeah, so bookmarks certainly in a REST API, and this is a little bit different from a web API, you shouldn't, right? You might be able to, but it makes an assumption that your API will never change. So if people are bookmarking them and you support bookmarking, you are effectively sort of locking down what your API is. It can never change because there might be bookmarks that would be broken by it. In a REST API, hopefully that's not too big a deal, right? The first time everybody comes in, they're traversing to certain URLs. So I used, as an example in my last talk, the GitHub API, right? While GitHub does unfortunately document a lot of URLs directly so that you could build them yourself, it also makes it very easy, given a single URL, if you hit api.github.com, everything that you could possibly get to can be gotten to via links. They're not really links, but close enough.
Yeah, but think about GitHub. Like, I might want to bookmark. I mean, there's tons of like good reasons for wanting to bookmark stuff in GitHub and not wanting to start at the, /GitHub.
Yeah, so somebody's got to be flexible, right? Either GitHub's got to say, people are bookmarking this particular URI, and there's nothing we can do about it, and therefore it is effectively concrete and can never be changed. Or they have to say, I am willing to break clients, and clients have to be willing to say, I've got a bookmark, and I hit it, and it gave me a 404. I need to try it again. I need to traverse the hierarchy again in that particular case, right? You'd hope the traversal of hierarchies is trivial, right? It is not in practice, but keeping it quick to get things that are going to give you links throughout, I think is a good first start. There's certainly some premature optimization if people are already bookmarking as soon as they hit an API. But again, that's sort of, it comes down to what your REST API does. If it takes it's 2 seconds every single call because it goes back to some database that's very slow and highly contended and stuff like that. Obviously, bookmarking is going to be something that people do, and in that case, you have to be ready to either break them and make them aware of that. I mean, that's the whole thing. One of the things I really harp on in my other session is this idea about documentation, right? The only way REST works is if there is really, really good documentation, and if that documentation says bookmark at your own risk, and a client gets broken because they've got a bookmark, they've been warned, right? They need to have some sort of facility to rectify, a bad bookmark at that particular point. But if you're not saying that, if you're sort of, implicitly saying, yeah, why not? Bookmark whatever you want, that'll be fine. That's kind of on you, right? Yeah. It's not a great answer, but it is. It is what it is. Next one back there, yeah. You, in the red thingy. Yes, you, white shirt. Certainly, yeah. So, it's really good. So, given a URL that exists, a good way to migrate bookmarks might be, redirects kind of thing. 303s and 304s, maybe? Is that what they are? Something like that? New location, or I don't know, can't remember. Moved. Yeah, you certainly could. I don't think there's really any great answer inside of Spring for how to do that. But in the context of something like this, another version of the cat controller that basically listened to, could a single method that knew how to map these things, or equivalent mappings that just returned 304 to the real thing. Certainly, that's a great way to do something like that. Help out, because I mean, certainly that's. It goes back to the bookmarking thing. REST APIs, I think this is less so, but the idea that Google, for example, everybody saw Spring I/O go up last night. We've got brand new URLs for all of our documentation and stuff like that. How do we not lose the SEO for our reference documentation, for our stuff that exists on there? And it's all done via redirects, permanent redirects, and stuff like that. So yeah, that'd be that'd be a great way to migrate it. See, something I hadn't even thought of. Another one. Look here. The question is about problems building a JavaScript application to dynamically traverse them. The answer to that question is I don't think there is one. We built a heavy-duty web UI that sat on top of this vFabric administration server with the logic to how to traverse it all. Let's say it was the REST side was simple tree traversal, right? It wasn't anything complicated. You could make the UI as complicated as you want, as heavyweight as you want. But in practice, as I was saying to someone over the break, there's a continuum, right? There's a continuum between normalizing everything. Every single piece of the payload, you only get exactly what's in that particular entity, and everything is linked off. And that means that your client may have to make 100 REST calls to get what they want. And that might be very, very slow, right, for them to make all these calls, even the ones that can be done in parallel through your web browser or something like that. On the other end of the spectrum is totally denormalized. You hit one URL, you get the entire data set, right? Top to bottom, everything in one single call. That has performance problems on its own as well. Big database joins, transmission time over the network and stuff like that. So the truth is somewhere in the middle of those two things. And so when it comes time to design a REST API, you need to sit down and honestly look at what are people going to do with this? What do I think a client's going to do? In the worst case scenario, you are Google, and you have no idea what people are going to do with this, right? But in practice, we all can do a little bit better than that, right? We kind of have an idea, and it gives us the ability to say, I know this person is always going to follow this post with a get to this next URL, so maybe this post should actually return the payload kind of thing to help things out, or maybe I should denormalize this. If they need, if they need an owner, odds are they're going to want all of their cats, so maybe I denormalize that to help that out. And it's sort of a performance thing. I see a JavaScript guy over here raising his hand. Do you have more to add?
Yeah, so the question about having a JavaScript client. So we do have a library called REST-js that does exactly that. It's part of Jupyter.js, which is somewhat affiliated with Spring, running several on the Spring team. And it has lots of built-in facilities for actually making requests, as well as for indexing links that come back from a database resource.
Yeah.
So what it'll do is actually it'll index those links and make it so that as you reverse your object graph, it'll just go and catch the next resource as you're navigating the object graph.
Yeah.
So there's a bunch of other capabilities built in to find the application.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the kind of thing as HOS is getting more and more play. I mean, it's certainly not new. I mean, Fielding did it, what, 14 years ago or something like that was when his dissertation was. Maybe it was actually 1994 even, a long, long time ago. It sort of got forgotten, right? REST got forgotten. We had SOAP for God's sakes. But it's back, and we're seeing stuff like the Cujo.js stuff that's making link traversal a little bit better than it has been, rather than having, I mean, I can't tell you the number of times in how many different languages I've wrote something that iterates over all of the links, finds the links, gets the link out, follows the link to the next link, stuff like that. It's boilerplate code. It's not hard to write something that traverses a tree of links, but you want library support for it for sure. Yeah.
So with this state here, suppose I understand as a consumer, I look up at the link relation and I follow the href.
Yep.
Href is an opaque thing for me.
Yeah, absolutely opaque.
There inside that.
Yeah.
How is this going to help the API evolution? So for example, in version 1, you had a cat.
Yep.
In version 2, you changed the cat to have more attributes.
Ah.
more properties.
We haven't gotten there yet. So the question is, what happens if you're not just changing URIs? What happens if you're actually changing the content of a cat? What indeed? Oh, sorry, I missed you. I'm sorry. It's up to you, right? They should be, right? And certainly all of the code that you've seen so far today that comes out of Spring HOS is done based on the servlet request, right? It's resolved against the host that it came in on to get it an absolute one. There's no reason not to do absolutes, and so it's generally considered a best practice. But again, there's no standard around any of this stuff. Yeah. So using HOS means that clients do not have to be changed if URIs change. How great is that? It doesn't matter if any of your customers listen to you. They're just, because they're well-behaved customers, as all customers are, it's going to be completely opaque to them, right? It's going to just change, and it doesn't matter, really, right? I will be the first to say, HOS can seem like a lot of initial setup work. You're writing all these resource things, trying to identify what links, what links actually need to be created between things. Making sure that all that stuff's ready to go is not, let's say, conducive to knocking out a REST service, before the weekend. Absolutely true. But Spring 4 HOS stuff makes it a lot easier. I think it really tightly encapsulates how links are made. I really genuinely love the method on thing, right? Given sort of a CRUD controller interface plus whatever your other stuff is kind of thing, but specifically like the CRUD read method to identify exactly how to create the URL for a given cat or for a given owner, and it encapsulates that mapping in exactly one place, I think is absolutely superb. I don't go into it in here, but if you really start digging deep into HOS, and I recommend that you do. There's our DevRel guy, Josh Long, has a GitHub repository called the Spring REST Stack, I believe is what it's called, and he dives really, really deep into things you can do with HOS, and it's unbelievable. Like, you don't even have to write the resource assemblers by the end of it, kind of thing. A couple of annotations here and there, and all of a sudden it miraculously knows how to create a self-link on a cat. And it notices that it links back, that there is an owner inside of the cat, so it knows to automatically put an owner link in for you and stuff like that. It's absolutely crazy what this stuff can do. So these things, make life easier. I wouldn't be put off. Certainly the gain of going with HateOS is absolutely completely offset, or offsets any pain for actually doing the development in the beginning. Yeah, and it's a good thing to see that this kind of stuff is rolling into Spring 4. If you don't trust my exuberance about HateOS, the fact that you're going to let this stuff into core Spring should tell you that it's probably pretty important. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah, and Spring 4. Yep. So it's not there yet. As a general rule, so the reason you're seeing straight Spring HateOS stuff right now is, as a general rule, I only do presentations with stuff you can actually use in production today. So it'll be great when it gets there. Other than package names, I would not expect any serious change between the APIs that you use today just as a separate project.
Yeah, that would be great. Like, we are using it, but we're building our links all, manually.
Yeah, take a look. I mean, take a look. The latest version is, I don't know, 0.70 or something like that, and it goes absolutely. So none of the stuff you saw up here is Spring 4 specific, right? All the stuff, the method on, there's like a enable hypermedia, enable MVC hypermedia annotations you put on something and stuff like that. All that stuff's already in there. I mean, 7.0 is what's going in, and it'll be Jurgenized, but it'll be the same. Yeah. Yeah. Does that include form handling, HateOS? I treat it differently, but it's really not, right? In many cases, I wish form would do a put instead of a post, but fundamentally, it's a payload coming back, and you handle it in exactly the same way. It's just a specially formatted payload. How you get that link? I mean, obviously, you're going to have to probably do some JavaScript to make sure that it's, sort of dynamically what the post backlink is going to be and stuff like that. But I don't think it's particularly different than just a straight REST API. Right? When I say a straight REST API, it's a horrible set of terminology, but a non-web consumed one, something you expect consumed by by a system rather than by a human. But I don't think it's fundamentally different, other than it's the way a form is handled is more limited than sort of the general case.
Anything about like standards around previous like Hale or
Yeah, so people are trying to standardize some stuff. It's REST. REST people don't really take to standards, right? My answer would be be wary of anything from standards body. Be very happy about de facto standards. If you find a lot of people around you using Hale, use Hale. If you find them using one of the other two that I can't remember the name of at the moment, use some of them. What's that? Siren, yeah, yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of stuff here. Spring HateOS, I believe, will output all three styles of the three major sort of standards around these kinds of links, depending on what exactly you want to do. In the end, documentation, 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 right? Make sure that people know what to expect to come back from your particular application. That's the best you can do, I think. Yeah. So we had a question a bit earlier here about media types, right? What happens if I've changed the cat? So a resource can be represented in different ways. It can be represented as JSON. It can be represented as XML. The client doesn't know what server is going to send it, and a server doesn't know what the client can handle over on the other side. Content types are negotiated using headers, such as the accept header and the content type header. So
What's a media type?
a media type, right. So what is a media type? A media type is basically a way to say, okay, let me take a step back. We say URIs represent entities, right? What is an entity? Right? Entity is it's a conceptual thing, right? It's not a physical thing. In your implementation in Java, it's a Java class probably. It's an instance of a Java class that can be accessed at this particular URL. But that doesn't mean anything to your client, right? That's a Java instance and a JVM over here on the other side of the world. So we have to have a representation of exactly what that is, right? So we know that we need to convert it to JSON, where we take all the Java Beans properties, put them in a JSON map. Or we have a Java object, and we take all those JSON Bean properties, and we put them into an XML document. I made the joke earlier, if you're a Maven developer, quite likely you're just going to put each one into an element rather than a bunch of attributes on a single element, right? But these are just representations of that particular entity. And so when we talk about media types, what we're actually saying is, I need to describe what that representation is. So when I say media types, I'm sure everyone in this room has seen the phrase application/JSON, right? Application/JavaScript, text/XML. It's basically a way of saying This is a JSON representation of the entity. This is an XML representation of the entity. And so, in general, the implementation inside of Spring, let's see, naive output. That sounds good. Looks something like this guy here. It's basically a way of saying that if you call me, if you call this particular URL, my naive output cats URL, I am going to hand you back something that is JSON, and I'm going to tell you that it's JSON. So tying this back into our earlier discussion of REST, this idea of content negotiation. A server can make a bunch of representations, maybe 1, maybe 10, who knows, right? A client can consume some representations. It could be completely disjoint in the worst case scenario. It could be overlapping in some way. They could potentially take multiple ones. And so there's this concept of negotiation where a client uses an accept header and says, I can accept JSON, XML, and CSV files or something like that in that priority order. That's the order I'd like to get them from you. And then the server looks at that and says, okay, here are the things you can consume, you will accept back from me. Here are the things I know how to produce. Where do they line up? Okay, we're going to make JSON. That's what we're going to do. And I'll render it out in JSON and tell you you've gotten JSON. Because that's the key, right? The client can request some stuff, but can't trust that they're going to get back, because it's quite possible that the server won't be able to produce what they're actually asking for. And so you get, anybody want to take a guess? Is it 405? Not acceptable, I think? Yeah. I see that quite a lot in my work. I always forget to check the little box for the content type. So we've always seen, I mean, everybody does this, right? Text HTML, text XML, application JSON. Really generic. It's better than nothing, right? It's in many cases, it's the way you tell Spring how you want to convert an object, right? So if we return this cat v1 right here, and we've marked it as @response-body using Spring MVC, something magical happens, right? We don't serialize a Java object and send a bunch of bytes over the wire to a client, right? Spring does something behind the scenes. And what it does behind the scenes is says, okay, I've negotiated that this needs to be XML. And in the case that it is XML, JSON, and in the case that it is JSON, I'll run it through, call it the Jackson JSON serializer, right? Turns it into JSON based on that. So many of us are already specifying some kind of media type, but it's a very naive media type, right? It basically is a way for us to say, to get Spring to do what it wants and say, this is JSON. But maybe you want something better than that, right? Maybe you want something like, something like that, right? Something much more strongly typed. Actually, you probably also want to do this. Say that it is still JSON, but it's of a very special type, right? It's mine, that's me, vnd.neb Hale. It is a cat, and it is version 1 of that particular cat, right? You have a question in there?
How does the client know that it can consume that?
Yeah. How can a client know that it can consume that? There's a couple answers there. The head call should tell what content types can be produced. But documentation. Yeah.
But isn't that a step backwards, because now you have limited the number of clients who can consume your feed?
Have you, though? Why do you think that we've limited the number of clients?
I think that if you look at the REST clients, at the end of the day, they are HTTP clients.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of HTTP clients are existing clients,
Mm-hmm.
which want to consume REST. So you're not in the business of changing clients. You're in the business of letting your existing clients consume more and more.
Yeah. So what would a client do then that would make them unable to consume this? Because it's just going to turn into JSON. It's exactly the same as if that said application JSON, right? We're going to render the exact same bytes out, right? But why wouldn't an existing client be able to handle that?
I think what we're doing here is we're bringing the concept of a schema somehow in this way by avoiding the schema itself. I mean, in the olden days, you had the XSVs. My client has the XSV. You can understand it. But now you're introducing this.
Yeah, so the complaint is that we're basically introducing some sort of structure, right? Some sort of versioning, some sort of schema about what exactly a cat looks like. You can't get away from that, right? The consumer has to know what a cat is going to look like when it gets there so that it can parse it out. But this just comes to sort of, I see arguing over there, Postel's law? Is that what it is? Yeah. You want to tell us what it is?
No, you.
It is be conservative in what you send and be liberal in what you accept, right?
Yeah.
That's the order? Yeah. And so that's basically it, right? If a user asks for just application JSON, we're going to do something, right? I wouldn't be surprised to find a lot of people doing this, right? If you have sort of a naive client, you know, we might do something like that, right? They can ask for just straight application JSON, and based on that, we're going to do some sort of simple mapping. We're going to choose whether it's going to be V1 or V2. But if you haven't asked us specifically, that's subject to change, right? But a lot of times, you only see that when the first version of the API that people started using were loosely typed. It just said JSON, right? Given some thought ahead of time, you wouldn't probably do that. You know, if you sort of think from the beginning of your API and you say, I need to be able to version this thing. And so you might end up with every entity having sort of versioned versions of it kind of thing, or maybe even unversions. Maybe you can ask for, you know, sort of the latest version of the cat if you're sort of on the other side, being liberal with what you accept from the client side kind of thing. But there's no way to get around the fact that regardless of whether you ask for application JSON or whether you ask for a cat that is formatted as JSON, you have to know what's inside that cat, right? Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, where are you? Oh. That allow you to fetch the schema. I would, yeah, exactly. And so there's a REST equivalent of that called Waddle that has gotten effectively no uptake. I don't think so. It's not the RESTful way, right?
How the hell do I know what I should say? And it's all very well being whatever was literally what it said.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. And I think it comes down to a documentation issue more than anything else. You've got to help your users use this thing, and that means defining exactly what the types that they can expect to come back with, exactly what the structure of those types are. I'm going to attempt to use while we're talking here, I'm going to attempt to use the conference Wi-Fi.
The issue with the answer around documentation is that you're assuming a human client, but a lot of clients are not human.
But they're programmed by humans, aren't they? That's the key, right? Is that someone's got to know.
Does Spring Data provide a way to integrate with JSON schema?
Sorry, one more time?
Spring Data provide a way to define JSON schemas within it when you're defining JSON representation of your resources?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the answer to that is yes. You can do a JSON schema with it. I have no experience with it because it's not sort of my style of doing things. But yeah, I believe it will do. Somebody Google that. I'm pretty sure. But so just as an example to attack part of this documentation problem head on, this is actually documentation for the REST API I created. And so you can see every endpoint is there. Ideally, I wouldn't have liked to have done the endpoint. It just happens to be an easy way to do it. It should actually be how you traverse links and stuff like that. I was not the lead of this project. I did not make that decision. But when I talk about documentation, I seriously talk about documentation. Exactly what error codes come out in a successful case, exactly what codes come out in exceptional cases, exactly what the type of the response payload should be, whether internally what the names of the properties are, name of a type string, links of this particular type. And if you take a look in that group of links in there, here are all the link names, right? All the rels. Here's what their cardinality is going to be. Here is what they do. Here is a nice little example so that if you're more of a visual learner, you might take a look at something like this and go, oh yeah, okay, so this looks right. Here are all those links that I might potentially get from this. So this is what I mean by humans programmed it at some point, right? And if it's documented well, this fact, you know, getting over the fact that, that we chose application JSON here, we were wrong when we did it, but we didn't know it at the time. If that said cat v1, and then we had another piece of documentation that described exactly what cat v2 was, no one forces the original client. You know, you're programming to this, you know that when you make your HTTP GET call, you need to say accept cat v1 kind of thing. In this case, we could easily migrate this, right? We would still have to accept the possibility that someone asked for application JSON, but we would then add cat v2 to it as well and do something slightly different. If you asked for application JSON, that inherently means you meant v1 instead. Yeah, over here.
So is that actually self-documenting, or do you have
Yeah, if I get that question again. The answer is we made it self-documenting, but in a totally non-portable way. When you end up with stuff of this size, especially the examples, we had this huge problem with the examples that they would get out of sync with what reality was. And so we had to we wrote a whole framework around to generate these examples. We actually bootstrapped the container, build all the objects, run them through a controller, have all the links built, and serialize them out the exact same way they would in Java to get that. And all of this sort of gets dumped into it's like a 4.5 meg JSON file or something like that. It's huge. I can't believe my browser rendered it even remotely quickly just now. And then just sort of has some syntactic sugar, some JavaScript that knows how to interpret that JSON file. I desperately hope someone will implement this. Swagger, if anybody's heard of that particular tool, great tool. It wasn't quite what we needed because it didn't go to this level of detail. On the other hand, it had the ability to interact through the web page kind of thing with the RESTful, the endpoints themselves. If somebody could do a hybrid of those two, I think there'd be great money in a product like that because self-documenting this is the only way to do it. It gets out of sync way too quickly, especially on the scale that we're talking about. Yeah. Nope. Nope. Unfortunately, I am otherwise occupied. But if anybody wants to, I have no problem. This code is, that bit of the code, I believe, is totally open source kind of thing. It was totally, we've got all sorts of custom annotations internally in the product that we trigger on and stuff like that. It's probably possible. JaxRS, for example, has documentation annotations inside of it so that it self-documents itself a bit. Again, what I consider to be sufficient documentation is very different than what most people consider to be sufficient documentation. But I have no doubt, well, I have some doubt, I would feel very confident pointing someone at this and saying, here is the documentation. This tells you absolutely everything you know to traverse our hierarchy and do anything you want to do. You need to create, you need to delete, you need to start, you need to do any of this stuff. It's all in here, kind of thing, right?
So if I have a Spring REST application, is this an open source that I can point to my application asking to
No.
create this?
No. This is totally, we wrote it as a one-off for an internal product. Yeah. I feel like I do realize that I am taunting you all with this. I do not intend to taunt you with it. It's just, and I'm just trying to give you an idea of when we say that documentation matters, documentation really, really matters in REST because it is so unstructured, because it is so flexible. The only way for someone to know what's really going on is to have it really well documented. So media types, right. So we talked about adding a media type to this guy, v1 JSON. We could do the same kind of thing for v2 now. Except this guy returns cat v2 instead, right? And if you demoed this, if I was able to demo this, what you would see here is that if I hit the exact same URL with two different accept headers, I would get two different payloads. In one payload, I would get cat v1. The one we'd taken a look at before just simply has a name inside of it. But we might also get, on the other one, cat v2, which has a new field, whisker count. Cat's got really scraggly whiskers for some reason. He loses them all over the place. So I really want to keep track of how many whiskers he currently has. And so we'd expect two different payloads to come out of that, right? But this is still a bit heavy, right? The big heavy bit is that we've got two different versions of the same cat. Two different versions of cat, as simple as it is, may not be that big a deal. Okay, so this slide sort of identifies a lot of stuff we were talking about. Defining and documenting different media types for every entity or system can be time consuming. It's offset though, it really is offset by how quickly and easily you can move and make changes. one of the key things I think to take away with this, and this is something that sort of goes back to the very first style of evolution we talked about, this slapping v2 in front of the URL, right, is that it's incredibly fine-grained, right? We're not talking about going to v2 of our API, right? We're talking to going v2 of our cat, which means that we can evolve each and every different type at its own rate as appropriate. And that's really key. It means that it's not sort of one day your API works like this, and then the next day it is radically different. It's constant evolution, right, as you go on, because you can evolve each individual entity type independently.
It almost seems like you're skipping the concept of versioning and just going into like a new type of request for getting the next level of the thing.
What do you mean?
It's just, like when I think of versioning, I think this first version is going to work,
Yep.
and it's going to be completely backwards compatible with the second one.
Yeah.
And this is, it's just more natural.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's getting away from the big break, right? Imagine, well, I mean, Google has actually done this between like versions 1, 2, and 3 of the Google Maps API are great examples. They are backwards incompatible with one another. And the problem is now that, 100 million people wrote apps against Google Maps v2, they can never shut it off, right? There's no way to sort of gracefully sort of incorporate these changes as they go along and allow people to, as they upgrade libraries and stuff like that, sort of gracefully do it. It's our evolution from big bang software development to agile software development, quick iteration cycles, things like that, right? How much easier is it if I can just change a cat, find out if everybody's cool with the new cat changes, and then go and make the owner changes, and God forbid, introduce a dog or something like that, right? Haven't offended any dog people, have I? So yeah, having v1 and v2 classes leads to a lot of duplicated code. Types, obviously, but somewhat less obviously, repositories that have to generate different types, services that have to consume and return different types. This is a problem, right? More and more and more code, bad, bad, bad. In practice, backwards compatible changes are typically additive, certainly by no means at all times, but in the case where they are, you can do some interesting things. I am going to do a demo involving JSON views, but for any sort of mapping layer that you use probably does have typically something similar to this. But basically what we're going to say is, given the latest cat, if the changes are additive, why can't we just only return cat v1 when cat v1 is required and return cat v2 when v2 is required? I will say that what you're about to see is probably the clunkiest thing in the demo. It's not sort of first-class scenario. I wrote quite a bit of code to do it, but it is an indication of what is possible. And if the 100 lines of code I wrote to do it are all you write and you get this level of compatibility inside of your application, it'd be pretty good. So JSON view output. So what we're going to do here is we are back to having only a single cat, a v1 cat. And in this particular case, if we take a look at the cat controller, we have two different versions of the method. Both of them return a cat that we've gotten out of the database. One listens for v1, one listens for v2. If my demo was running, it would render this out, and unfortunately we'd see whiskers in both cases, right? This is because we have whiskers in the one cat type, because fundamentally the database behind the scenes has been upgraded to have whisker count inside of it. So what can we do? Because it's sort of an additional entry that we don't always want, why can't we use an annotation to say this should only be in version 2? And maybe you have a version 3 that extends version 2. So all the new things that came in version 2 are in version 3, plus some new things that exist in version 3 as well. And so using a little bit of Jackson-specific stuff, it's possible to say, you can say, and again, this is not great, but it is what it is. Static interface, call it v2. You have to have kind of a marker interface, but then you can say at JSON view, and then you could say v2.class. And so this would be a way that you could basically mark individual properties as being from version 2 or from version 3. So in the case that this gets rendered for version 1, it renders anything that's not marked. In the case where it's rendered for version 2, it's going to render everything from version 1 and from version 2. And then if there was a version 3, it wouldn't do that, but if you did version 3, you'd get all of them kind of thing. And then on the other end of it, you could simply say, response view, and you can say cat.v2.class. And so this would enable you to basically say, when I render this guy, I want to render all of the v2 kind of stuff. And this is sort of native to Jackson, this idea of response. Response view actually is something I implemented, but the JSON view stuff is obviously Jackson specific. But it, again, does work, actually. So now, even though every single time we get a cat, right, and that cat has a whisker count, you'd assume that V1 clients didn't care about the whisker count, so we're not going to render it. You know, we'd hope that they were being very conservative and only looking for a name inside of it, not, you know, something stupid, parsing a string, expecting ordering or something like that. But just to be safe, let's not send that stuff over, right? Or you could do, yeah. So let's stop. Let's leave that there. But in the case where v2 is called for, let's go ahead and send all of that information as well. And it allows us to basically remove the duplication of code. We basically are evolving the code base so that the latest is always good, but we maintain backwards compatibility by saying what was actually the definition of what gets sent, what was the payload that actually gets sent away. And so, yeah. Allows you to simply annotate a type if it's Jackson specific, but most serializers have some concept of that.
This is specifically a Spring annotation?
No, so you are well into the realm of I wrote some code. If you take a look behind the scenes, like response view, that's my annotation. If you take a look at like the view injecting, this is a thing where we sort of notice, you know, there is some code in here that notices if you have annotated a handler method to only return version 2 and does sort of the JSON view stuff behind the scenes. I would love it if Spring Core would incorporate this stuff in there. I don't think so. It's kind of an off case. It's, you know, a little bit too small to make it into Core Spring. That being said, all this code is public. There's a link for any of it. It's all ASL. Feel free to take it as you see fit, improve it, feed it back. I think there's some value here. I genuinely, I mean, we've done this, right? We've taken JSON views so that we could maintain a single unified internal data model in the cases where things were additive. And in truth, not as I said before, trying to maintain backwards compatibility may not be totally additive. And in that case, you do have to split it out into different types, and you might have an inheritance hierarchy and stuff like that. But in the case where you don't need to have that, I think this is a much nicer way to attack the problem. So, a roundup, and then we'll do some Q&A because you guys haven't asked enough questions. APIs change, and your code needs to cope with that. The trick is managing that evolution throughout your API. As we heard earlier, difference between sort of a big bang change, which everybody does today. I mean, if you take a look at the documentation, I wonder if I still have it up, we are guilty as the next guy. We hit Gemfire/V1. We were big bang people, right? This was wrong when we did it. We know that now. You want to take changes small, you want to take them iteratively, you want to make sure that you get a really quick feedback loop. Don't take a look at REST as a limiter. So many people look at their 4 verbs and say, to hell with this, right? I'm not doing this. The simplicity frees you to do all sorts of other things. Because I know there's only a limited set of things that my clients could do to me, it gives me a very small domain that I actually need to manage change across. Embrace HateOS. Next time, I will make sure that it's somewhere in the description of my talks. Everybody take a look. Spring HateOS project and what's getting rolled into Spring 4, really, really good stuff. And it will, in the end, make evolution of your APIs much easier. Link relations, media types to do that. If using Jackson, JSON views can be used to build an annotation style model, but if you use any serialization, they're going to have something that does that kind of stuff, right? And that's it. Much like Loki, my little puss there, I am very, very tired, but I'm happy to take your questions and answers. Thank you, guys. Yeah, question. all hell breaks loose. They don't support it. Ambiguity, the first rule of Spring, I always say, is when ambiguous, fail. And so I tracked down the piece of code because I was wondering the exact same thing the first time I used it, and it says if there's more than one URL, system exit, throw an exception, which is reasonable. What could it do, right? What could it do that would satisfy everybody? And so yeah, in cases where you're doing multiple URLs, it's just not going to work for you. Yeah.
So if you're using JPA, you have lazy associations.
Yeah.
Standardly, when you use Jackson and their Hibernate plugin, they just usually return null for all of those.
Yeah. It's because if you're using lazy loading, literally there's nothing. You're lucky you're getting null. In many cases, you're likely to get lazy initialization error because you're outside the transaction in all likelihood.
If you know it's lazy, but with the OS, would you represent every one of those as a link so the client can then pull that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, if you know that all this content's going to be lazy, why wouldn't you just link to everything so that it never has to be initialized? That's great. Absolutely great. I would. That's way over at the end of never encapsulate any other data other than your own entity. Are you satisfied with someone? If someone needs all of that data nearly every time they use it, right? If every time, because I'm running a vet shop, and every time I pull an owner, I need to see his list of cats underneath him. Shouldn't I denormalize that so he doesn't have to make 2 calls? I mean, might that add up? It's an optimization thing, right? Where everything is linked on one end and nothing is linked on the other. You do what's right. If you're doing lazy initialization, absolutely start with link everything. And then when you find out that your server's having to, you've got one user and it's servicing 250,000 requests a second or something like that, then maybe it's time to start taking a look at going the other way. But until you know that you've got a performance problem, I wouldn't, right?
So, well, it's not just performance, but just trying to expose it in generic ways. Are there any other, with the Spring OS project or what's coming in before, are there any things that help you, turn that from lazy instead of just null? Or do you have to roll it all?
That's a good question. Yeah. So if it notices that it has not been lazily initialized, create a link for it instead. I am not the project lead of Spring OS. Oliver Gierke, he's around. I'm sure he'll be down in the open area. He's the guy to talk to about that. Seems like a great idea. I know right now that it will notice a particular type and create a link automatically on that type, maybe adding a little bit of extra knowledge to say if this is a Hibernate proxy or something like that and hasn't been instantiated, you should do it automatically. Yeah, definitely talk to him or open an issue on the GitHub. That's a great idea. Yeah.
Any experience with public APIs and KOS specifically? I know that I just finished building my last company a pretty large user base public API, and his answer was just completely, our user base would absolutely hate this.
Well, let me show you a little story here then. Oh, well, I didn't even hit enter and it did that. Actually, I wonder if I can hit it without a token. No, what was it, HTTPS?
In all fairness, I don't know if that was actually the voice of the customer or
Yeah.
purported voice of the customer.
Okay, so let's take a look at GitHub's API. Can we all agree that a lot of people use GitHub's API? GitHub uses its own API. Let's say that this is not what you'd expect for links, but it is links, right? If you want to get to the gists for a particular gist, you don't have to know that URL. You hit api.github.com, it's there for you, right? This is, even though you can go to this web page, they basically had the same sort of conundrum that we did, where people are looking at, developers are looking at the URIs. How do you tell them this is what it looks like, right? This is what you're actually looking for. Sorry. This is what you're actually looking for, but don't really use that. So they document the structure of that API in the same way we did, but they don't expect you to hard code those values in. I'm sure because this is here, people hard code the hell out of it, right? You'd hope they didn't, but certainly all of my interaction with that API has been on links. If you take a look at the websites, this API is what is the underlying data store for the GitHub website itself. And so you see really crazy things. When I talk about this optimization and stuff like that, you see that in certain places there are sort of oddball entities included in, and it's so that they needed to pull anytime a user comes up, they need to pull all of the organizations. So they sort of pack in all the organizations because it's such a common use case for them. But they traverse links to do it all as well, right? They do bookmark, to the bookmarking guy, they do bookmark for the life of the browser session. And I'm sure that, if they change it during the life of your browser session, you hit command refresh and you're good to go kind of thing. It sucks, but who cares kind of thing. But the same kind of thing. This is a serious API that uses links. I think it's here, right? These guys know what they're doing clearly. And maybe customers are complaining about it, but yeah. So it's how many zeros have to be on the check before you before you do the wrong thing. Yeah.
So in the case of cat and owner, you could have, your question about this building, you could have a cat as an owner, nested object, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pass back this ID of the owner.
Yep.
Even if you later build it.
Yeah, absolutely. But what would you do with it, right? Because it's certainly not the ID of the owner. You could pass back a URI that represented the owner, right? Because remember, it's got to be opaque. The ID is useless on its own.
You would recommend that's with links.
Yep, absolutely. Because what do you do, right? I now know that it's owner 0. How do I get to owner 0? What's the URI for owner 0 kind of thing? Yeah, exactly, yeah. So you want a link that points to, localhost 8080/owner/0, because then I don't have to ask that question. I never have to go to the documentation and say, oh, I need to put a 0 right here in the middle of this string. Yeah.
So I'd like to get these TSNs to encapsulate the version
Mm.
of what you're sending back. But don't you run into the same problem there where you can have somebody still on P2 and you're on P5 and you have to shut down at some point?
Yep, absolutely. But it is an easier migration. It's not sort of a big bang. Let me take a step back and say there are certain techniques that we've looked at today that make migration transparent to the user. But there are many migrations that cannot be transparent to the user, right? The structure of payloads is a classic example of things that the user is going to need to know about. So while we attack part of the problem as let's make the user know as little as possible, we also have to attack the other problem in the case where the user has to know, how do I minimize the amount of code to maintain backwards compatibility? So a lot of the stuff that we looked around media types was not about insulating the user. It was about insulating me from the problems that they signed an 8-figure check and I'll be supporting this until I die kind of API. Yeah. So yeah, definitely a real problem that you can't. It becomes more of a social problem getting people to move to newer versions of the API.
In case you use text HTML
Yeah.
as the media type, how do you resolve it? Do you have any examples?
There are view resolvers in Spring, right? So if it's text HTML and I have put in like an internal resource view resolver that delegates to free marker or something like that, it sort of knows that that's the kind of thing that can handle HTML and will resolve it that way.
Use the internal view resolver.
Yep, yeah, exactly. Because, that's the key. None of the stuff that we've seen is specifically REST specific, because I didn't use the fancy REST controller API that everybody saw last night. Everything I did is just standard Spring, right? Standard Spring MVC. You'd write exactly the same code if you were trying to render HTML instead of JSON. You have a content negotiation for it. It would drop to a renderer. The renderer would execute in some way, whether it's free marker, velocity, what have you kind of thing, and it would kick some data out. And so it's perfectly reasonable. Like if you needed to return both XML and JSON, potentially, if you need to support both of those things, you just have resource view resolvers for both of them. And then you'd have one for free marker as well.
There's actually a specific view resolver called content negotiating view resolver.
Yeah.
Which allows you to plug in a strategy.
Sure, yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I sort of take advantage of the fact that Spring is super, super smart. If it notices Jackson, it automatically adds a mapping Jackson message converter thingy transparently. If JAXB is available on your class path, it will automatically add one that goes to XML, but that is not the typical case, right? They added them because there is a de facto standard in Java for both of those kinds of serializations. You would expect to define view resolvers and stuff like that normally if you were writing a Java web or a Spring Web application. Yeah.
You use two URI there was no owner, right? In one URI there was no owner and one URI with no owner.
Yeah.
What are the advantages? Because if there is no owner, you can always send the owner in the request body.
Yeah.
So what are the advantages, disadvantages of
Yeah, so Yeah, so the question is around, sometimes it's important to have the owner ID in the URL, and sometimes it's not, because you could just say, when you did your GET request, pass in a payload that had the owner ID. It's simplicity, primarily. In the case where there is hierarchical data, if it's encapsulated in the URI, it's one less payload you have to create, one less thing you have to put in the payload. But it's sort of key on hierarchical data, right? If every cat has a unique identifier, then who cares what its owner is, right? It'll have back in the database, it'll have some reference to its owner, so having it in the URL isn't particularly important. But in the case where a cat's ID is unique inside of its owner and not globally unique, then you do actually need to know the owner ID so that you can then traverse to the cat itself. And in that particular case, why make someone have to type that value in? And how would they even know it, right? Right. How do you pass the request owner back? Because you don't know the ID of the request owner. In no payload do I ever send an ID back. All you get is this big opaque URL. You'd have to parse that URL to know what the ID of the owner is, right? So you don't really actually have a pointer. You have a pointer to an owner, but you don't have a unique identifier in the context of the server for that particular owner. So that's why, sort of encapsulating it in the URI is a little bit better in that particular case. Again, stylistic. If I try and make hierarchical things hierarchical in the URI, because in practice it's nice to have that information a lot of times. Not always, and you sort of go back and forth on it, but we found that it was better just to do hierarchical data as a hierarchy of URL.
If it has to be in hierarchy, how long the URI can be, is there a limitation in that?
There used to be like 255 characters in browsers and stuff like that, but that was sort of a browser bar kind of limitation. This is the problem. I talked to a group this big. When I talk about this stuff, I talk about writing a Python application or something like that that's going to do this, or another Java application that needs to communicate on a service. Web developers have sort of a different set of constraints, right? In certain cases, you can't even do a put, right? You got post and get. That's all you got. And you got to try and do everything through that. People might have to type in or have the URL exposed to them. I am a big fan of being as descriptive as possible in a URL right up until a user sees it. And then all of a sudden it should not be ugly, right? Think of how easy it would have been for GitHub to say, github.com/12345678910 is my ID kind of thing, but they didn't. They crafted a URL that with something they almost certainly internally do not use as a key, right? Nobody uses a string as a key in their database. They've got some synthetic UUID or integer or something like that that actually represents me. In fact, I think I can get that. So I'm a big fan of who the hell cares if your consumer is a computer, and be very careful and very pretty if your consumer is going to be a human. One last one in the back there. Yeah. Yeah, so an abstract-based class is a perfectly reasonable thing to do that, except now I've got two classes, right? I can do better than two classes in some cases. In some cases, I can't, absolutely. If you remove a field or something like that, then because no one was using it, then you can't use backwards compatibility even, or you can't use an abstract-based class. Or maybe you do have a common one. There's a common sort of root one and a v1 over here and a v2 over here kind of thing. It's purely stylistic. In that particular case, I went with two completely separate versions for clarity's sake on here, so I didn't have to traverse up a hierarchy and show you that it inherited all this stuff. But abstract-based classes would be good there, but not good enough, in my opinion. Yeah. Okay, thanks, everybody. Feel free to talk to me now, during lunch, whatever.